all of these different terms and phrases and behaviors that I at one point thought were specific to me or my family, I was now starting to realize were not such an isolated experience. Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 23. In this week's episode, I want to talk all about what 26 was like for me. I celebrated my birthday this past week. I turned 27, and as you do, I was reflecting on this past year and what it's meant to me, the different things that I've done, and I guess what I will look back on, or what I think I'll look back on when I'm older, when I think about what my life was like when I was 26. What I did when I was 26. And so it seemed like the perfect thing to talk about in this week's episode, because this past year, more than any in my life, I would say I've focused the most on my mental health. And I was kind of reflecting on my past birthdays, my recent birthdays, mainly in the last 5 years since I moved out of my parents' house. And up until this most recent one, I would say the things that I looked back on when I would get to a birthday and I would sort of reflect on that year were external accomplishments. Maybe it was something really cool that Brandon and I had built, or maybe we built the most pieces of furniture in a month that we ever had, or maybe we traveled somewhere really cool. We took a road trip across the country. I think so much of what defined particular years of my life, or I guess chapters of my life up until this point, has been or have been outside of myself, sort of external accomplishments that I would look to. And I think the biggest difference about this past year, when I was kind of reflecting on my birthday and thinking, what did I do this year? So much more of what I'm proud of in this last year has been internal. I feel like internal accomplishments are what kind of define my 26th year. I feel like there was a lot of personal growth and development that happened in this past year. And, I didn't build anything crazy. I didn't travel anywhere, but I feel like a different person now than I did this time last year. Probably more so than I ever have. I feel like this is the greatest change personally that's taken place, or I guess evolution in my life that I can think of in these last birthdays of mine. And I'm really excited to talk about it and to kind of get into some of the specifics, some of the things that I really struggled with a year ago that now, having spent so much time researching narcissism and mental health and really taking the time to implement these more positive behaviors in my life, kind of reflecting on how I feel now as opposed to then. I feel like this time last year, I was maybe just starting to scratch the surface of, okay, maybe some of what went on throughout my childhood wasn't entirely healthy. I think I was starting to feel some of these things without necessarily knowing what to call them. I don't think I was able to put words to these emotions yet. I didn't know a lot of these different terms or phrases that I know now that really explain a lot of what so many of us went through throughout our childhoods that inform who we are as adults, our decisions, our actions, our reactions. And I think a lot of what has happened over the last year for me is just answering those very foundational questions. Who am I? Who do I want to be? Why am I the way that I am? And I think spending such a chunk of time sort of dedicated to answering those questions, or at least taking steps to start to try to answer them, has been really beneficial in my healing journey as a whole, I would say, throughout 26. So back in July, I feel like that's really kind of when it all started for me. Brandon and I got married in June, and it was shortly after that I ultimately made the decision to go no contact with my parents. And then in July, I had seen this book, quotes from this book going around, The Science of Stuck by Britt Frank. And all of these little quotes that I would see on TikTok or Instagram, I was like, wow, this really resonates with me. And so I decided to buy the book. I read the book, and that was sort of my launching point for my healing journey. I had no idea what that book would do for me, that now a year later, I would be sitting here 23 episodes into a mental health podcast with over 60,000 people who have made the decision to follow along on my healing journey. It's still pretty mind-blowing when I think about it, but I'm so thankful that for anyone who's dealt with something like this or is currently dealing with these emotions or these toxic relationships, that now there's a safe space, that you found me and our virtual paths crossed, I guess, because everything that I share, I imagine a younger version of myself seeing those things. And I ask myself, what would she have benefited from this? And I'm thrilled to just be providing resources and offering up my own perspective to hopefully make dealing with something that is so hard to deal with just a little bit easier. So I got this book, I started doing some research, and it was really sort of addicting because the more I learned about narcissism and the long-term effects of growing up with a narcissistic parent, narcissistic abuse, all of these different terms and phrases and behaviors that I at one point thought were specific to me or my family, I was now starting to realize were not such an isolated experience. These are things that have been studied, that have been written about by mental health professionals, by healthcare professionals in books and articles, things that I could look to now to help kind of explain my own experience and to start to move forward in a really positive, healthy way to create a life that I want for myself moving forward. So I started reading these books, and then it was back in September when I first started posting on social media, which I had no idea, again, what this would do. I wanted to document how I was feeling at this really sort of pivotal moment in my life. I think once I had that book, once I started to do a little bit more research and I was finally able to put words to these emotions and these behaviors, it all started to make so much sense to me. And I very much felt like I was starting something. I was at the beginning, sort of at the starting line of the next chapter of my life. And I'm really happy that I had that feeling, I guess, to just sit down and talk about it. Because now, it's sort of like a full circle moment. Not that I am done by any means in terms of healing or growing, but I remember feeling a little hopeless in that time. I guess when I was sitting there, I felt so overwhelmed. I think when you start to realize your childhood trauma, it can be like a wave of emotions and memories, and it's so much to take on at once because everything that you had thought your life was up until a certain point is now sort of completely flipped on its head, and you start to rethink everything, different interactions, relationships that at one point in your life you thought meant something, you kind of perceived them in a particular way, that now looking back at them through this completely different lens, now that maybe you've educated yourself a little bit about why those things maybe didn't sit too well with you, or maybe why you react in a certain way as an adult that doesn't feel entirely healthy, now they mean something completely different. And that's a lot to take on, especially because of how frequently these things can happen. I remember having a lot of those realizations and those aha moments when I would be feeling something and experiencing it in my own life, sort of oblivious to it, like having issues trusting others. And then I would have this epiphany where I would have a really specific memory sort of make its way to the surface. And something that I never thought anything of throughout my childhood, now understanding all of these different things about narcissism and manipulation and control, looking at it again as an adult, again through this different lens, it's so much clearer to me what was actually happening. And so you sort of redefine a lot of experiences that you've had throughout your life, which can be entirely overwhelming. And so I'm happy that I'm actually able to do what I set out to do when I made that first video, which is look back and feel proud of how far I've come personally. So I kind of want to break this up into two different sections. I want to reflect on some of the more negative behaviors and impulses that ultimately I picked up and mimicked from my narcissistic parent that I was implementing into my own life that after making an effort to start to understand them a bit more, to let them go and to take on new, more positive behaviors that can serve me in a better way, I am now more seamlessly integrating into my life now that the year has kind of passed. So things that I once struggled with that now I'm not struggling with as much. And then I also want to talk a little bit more about what my future goals are, what 27 looks like for me. And so the first one that I want to start off with is direct communication. That was one that I struggled with for a really long time. That now at this point in my life, I feel really confident about my abilities to directly communicate with the people in my life. And that has been such a game changer. I think the first part of this that I struggled with was expecting my partner and other people in my life to read my mind, to always be paying attention to how I was feeling, how I was acting, the tone that I was using, and allowing those things to sort of inform their decisions about how they interacted with me. And this was just very much, I think, me not knowing anything different. This was kind of just what I had grown up around. This is what I had grown used to. And so I was doing what I had observed throughout my childhood. And I struggled a lot with my partner not always picking up on these really subtle things because I thought that if he didn't do that, it meant that he didn't love me, that he didn't care about me. And now, right, even in the book that I'm currently reading, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents by Lindsay Gibson, she talks about how one of the sort of key phrases of an emotionally immature parent is, if you really loved me, you would just know. And I had no idea how unhealthy that way of thinking was, or even that was a way of thinking that was shared amongst a spectrum of emotionally immature people. I thought, again, this was sort of just the way that things were. This was the way that my parent was, and so this was sort of the way that I was. And it took me a long time to realize that, okay, it's not everyone else's responsibility to try to assume or predict what I want, when I want it, and how I want it, without ever being directly told those things. It's my responsibility as an individual to know what I want, when I want it, and how I want it, and to communicate those things to the people in my life. And looking back now, it seems so much more it is so much more straightforward. It's easier for everyone involved. It's the right way to do things. And yet for so many of us, I think, who were raised by a narcissistic parent, you're not often encouraged to directly communicate your own wants or needs. And you're also expected to sort of pick up on all of these really subtle changes in mood or tone or behavior of your parent, and then to adjust your own behavior accordingly. So not only are you encouraged not to speak directly, but no one is speaking directly to you. And there's sort of this cloud of care and love that's sort of mixed in with all of this, where moving forward into adulthood, into friendships or romantic relationships, if you've got someone who's not picking up on these really subtle hints, it's very easy to feel like they're not doing those things because they don't love and care about you. And that if you have to say directly what you want or how you're feeling, then there's no thoughtfulness there. They're not thinking about you. They don't just know there's something lacking in that more intimate part of the relationship, when in reality, there's nothing lacking. Telling your partner directly something that you want to do or something that's important to you, maybe something that you're looking for in a relationship, and then having them actually go out of their way to make the effort to do that thing, it doesn't take any of the thoughtfulness or the care out of that gesture. It's your responsibility to inform them and to let them know what's important to you. And I think the second part of direct communication that was harder for me to kind of start to feel comfortable doing, I guess, is stating my own needs. And this ties right back into that hypervigilance, where if I wanted to watch a TV show with my husband, a particular TV show or movie, there was a time when I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that out loud because already I was starting to think, okay, well, what if he doesn't want to watch a movie right now? What if he doesn't want to sit down and just watch TV for the next 2 hours? What if he doesn't like the movie that I pick? What if he's not feeling it? And if we ultimately decided to watch the movie that I suggested, I would be paying way more attention to how he was feeling, right? Is he enjoying it? Trying to read his body language. Maybe I'll ask him, maybe I'll make a joke, try to lighten the mood because I feel like the mood is down. Maybe it's a little quiet. I am hyper fixated on him. I'm overanalyzing the situation. And at the end of the day, that would take a lot of the enjoyment out of the actual movie that I wanted to watch, where I wouldn't even enjoy the experience because I would be way too concerned with the emotions and feelings of someone else. And again, I think that's a really common experience for a lot of us who were raised by a narcissistic parent. That's what we were taught to do over time. And the better we got at that, the better our position in the family was. Something else that I used to struggle so much with were intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts were something that I dealt with way before I knew that intrusive thoughts were a thing. I didn't know where they came from. I thought it was just my inner monologue. I didn't think that there was anything wrong with what was happening in there, but it definitely didn't feel good. And it really got in the way. There were times when the voice in my head was so loud with just these really negative hypothetical scenarios that were so specific to my deepest rooted fears and insecurities that it was hard for me to focus on what was actually going on, or if someone was speaking directly to me, for me to hear what they were saying over the voice inside my head. And once I started to learn what intrusive thoughts were, right? Or I guess that those things that I was enduring, that I was suffering, were intrusive thoughts. And then I took it one step further and I started to understand where they came from, why I was having them. Giving these things a name definitely took away a lot of their power for me. And it was almost kind of like staring them in the face, because it was no longer something that I was afraid of. It was no longer something that had power over me, because now I knew that it was there. It was like I turned the lights on. I wasn't scared of the dark anymore because I saw it for what it was. And I still sometimes struggle with intrusive thoughts. I think sometimes they still show up. And I think that's a relatively universal experience for most people, even if you weren't raised by a narcissistic or an emotionally immature parent. I think sometimes as humans, we just have a tendency to catastrophize, even if it's just in passing. And, I think that's okay, as long as you don't let those thoughts sort of dominate your actions or dictate how you're feeling for the rest of that experience, the rest of that day. And so when I experience, or I guess encounter, an intrusive thought now, I have kind of two ways of going about it. There are times when an intrusive thought will pop up and I'll just distract myself, where it's kind of there and it's there in the back of my head, but I don't give it the time of day. I don't entertain it because I'm like, I see you, I know that you're there, but I'll shift my attention to something else. I'll shift my focus to something else. And then I get to the point where I have trouble remembering exactly what it was. And the weird part about intrusive thoughts that I've dealt with is that there was a time when I felt like I had to think them. I had to think them and I had to entertain every single awful scenario. And if I wasn't doing that, then I in some way was doing myself a disservice. Like I was not prepared for something. Like I have to weigh all of these options, even though they will never happen, right? I was just torturing myself. And so now sometimes these intrusive thoughts will come, I'll distract myself and I'll revisit the thought almost instinctually, where it's like, wait, what was that about? And what was really bad about it? I try to sort of get back into the nitty gritty of it. And I have to fight that impulse where I say, listen, it was an intrusive thought. It was a passing thought. You don't have to revisit this really negative hypothetical scenario because you know what it is and it's not going to benefit you and it's not actually a real feasible thing that you have to be concerned about. So let's think about what's going on right now in your life that you should be concerned about. And the other way that I deal with intrusive thoughts when they pop up, which it's fine. I think it's fine when intrusive thoughts pop up as long as you know how to handle them. The other way that I deal with them is, again, to kind of just stare them in the face, where it's like, okay, I know what you are and I know why you're here. And then I ask myself, is this grounded in reality? Do I have any real reason to be thinking about this right now? Is there a possibility that this is going to happen and cause me harm in the near future? And if I can confidently answer all of those questions, I can let it move on. I sort of register it as just a thought. And that's fine because I am not my thoughts. I think separating myself and my life from the things that I think or even the emotions that I experience in passing has been really beneficial, where it's like, I am not what I think about. So I'll engage you, I'll entertain you for a minute and sort of register that you're here, but I'm going to deal with you now so that I can just let you go and you're not going to linger in my mind for the rest of the day. You're not going to pop back up tomorrow or later on this week. It's very much the same mentality when you're going through any sort of healing or realizing your trauma, where you have to sit with a lot of discomfort. And that's a really difficult thing to do because everyone likes to be comfortable. But it's only when you sit with those really uncomfortable emotions, those maybe uglier truths, things that you've been suppressing because you didn't want to address them. When you finally stare those things in the face, it's like when you're a kid and you're afraid that there's a monster under the bed, right? It's so easy to just lay there in bed under your covers, pull them up over your head and be scared, but you're laying there and so you feel kind of safe. But all of your worries would go away if you could just build up the courage to get out of bed and look under the bed and find that there's nothing there. It's sort of this leap of faith that you have to take, right? That even if there is something there, right, you have the ability to handle it. But it's kind of just, it's recognizing that I think a lot of our fears are only fears because we're scared of facing them, if that makes sense. That might have been a little redundant, but that's kind of how it felt for me, where I finally would just, if I have an intrusive thought now, it's like, I'll get up out of bed. I'll look under the bed. I know it's there. You know what I mean? I'm not scared of it because there's probably nothing. And if there is something, I can handle it. I can deal with it. And so that's been really helpful for me in managing my intrusive thoughts. Another one that I really struggled with for a while was taking on other people's emotions as my own. And I experienced this mainly with my partner, just because of the nature of our relationship and how close we are. We live together, we work together. And so anytime he would feel frustrated or overwhelmed or stressed, I would subsequently sort of take on those same emotions as my own. And I remember having conversations with him where he would tell me, you know, you can't get mad at me for being mad. And I remember sort of reflecting on these different experiences, and it started to make a lot of sense once I started to educate myself a little bit more about mental health and, you know, healing from trauma. I remember growing up, like so many of us, I'm sure, feeling like I constantly had to walk on eggshells. Like I was always doing everything in my power to prevent anything negative from crossing paths with my narcissistic parent, because I knew what that meant, right? If my narcissistic parent was triggered and they were frustrated or overwhelmed, they would sort of, again, in this same book, she talks about emotional contagion. I think emotionally immature parents express themselves in very similar ways to babies, to newborns, where they don't yet have words to describe their emotions, and so they act them out. They sort of do these big things. They act out their emotions so that everyone in their environment has to kind of shift their attention to this person to try to make them feel better. And so throughout so many of our childhoods, I'm sure, if our narcissistic parent was feeling stressed or overwhelmed or frustrated, that was a bad thing for everyone involved, for everyone in the house. And so in adulthood, in a healthy relationship now, it took some practice for me to realize that I can trust my partner as an emotionally mature individual to handle their own emotions. It's not my responsibility to try to regulate their emotions for them or to solve whatever problem it is that they're facing that's causing them this frustration. And I think developing that trust and showing myself through practice and sort of repetition that I can rely on my partner to do these things without my help has been massively beneficial in not taking on other people's emotions as my own. Because for so long, I felt like it was my responsibility to fix things, to diffuse a situation, to mediate an argument, to kind of take over and offer suggestions to a problem that was causing a lot of stress or tension. And relieving yourself of those responsibilities is a really difficult thing to do, because I think for so many of us, that was just our normal throughout our childhood. And we do it so consistently for such an extended period of time that it's almost like a reaction. It's just an instinct almost. And the way that I was able to let that go, again, was just through practice. And, realizing that in those moments, when my partner is feeling stressed or overwhelmed about something, I don't have to swoop in and try to stop him from feeling stressed, right? Because he's allowed to feel stressed. That's a normal emotion that a lot of people experience. And instead of trying to just come in and fix things right away, I can sort of validate him in that. And I'd say, hey, why are you feeling stressed? It's okay. Don't worry about it. Is there anything that I can do to help you? It's in those moments now where my role has completely changed from the person trying to fix things to the person who's offering support and comfort and validation to another person. And that, I think, has been really beneficial in our relationship for us together, where we both realize that when either of us is feeling a more negative emotion, that is when the other person has to sort of step up and be even more patient and more understanding than we are on an average day, because that's when our partner needs it the most. And so that switch has been, again, massively beneficial, not only for me in trusting my partner to work these things out on their own, but also in our relationship as a couple. One of the things that kept me from posting on social media for a long time, even with our furniture business, was feeling incredibly uncomfortable with inconsistencies. I remember thinking that, everything that I posted had to meet a certain standard, and the font and the text should be the same and the filter should be the same. I was very uncomfortable with inconsistencies. And that applied also to waking up and sort of having this mental to-do list in my head, and then not checking off all the boxes by the time the day was over, because I felt like I wanted to be consistent in my routine, in my schedule, in the things that I set out to do throughout the day. And if I didn't do that, then I sort of felt like a failure. I felt guilty because I wasn't as productive as I wanted to be when I first set out. Even though my mental to-do list would be way longer than what was actually realistic. And that took me a while to sort of let go of, to start to realize, okay, I'm not a machine. I don't need to be doing something productive every waking hour of the day, right? But again, I think when you trace the roots of that mentality back for so many of us, it's because throughout our childhoods, we were valued not simply for who we were, right? But for what we did. And so it's a strange concept to feel okay with just existing and not always filling your time with something. You don't always have to be doing something to be living a positive life or to have good relationships or to feel proud of what you did throughout that day. I started to realize recently too that I think my struggle with inconsistencies, why they made me feel so uncomfortable, was maybe tied to a little bit of anxiety, perfectionism, control, right? I remember feeling like throughout my childhood, I never wanted to put anything out into the world that was less than perfect, because I wanted to minimize my chances, I guess, of failure, of criticism, of punishment. And I think that sort of manifested itself in my adult life in these ways that I was just talking about. It sort of persisted into my adult life. And now, knowing that I'm in a safe space, I'm comfortable with who I am, and I'm in a healthy relationship, I don't always have to be performing and performing perfectly to feel proud of myself or to receive attention or affection from other people in my life. It's a complete whirlwind, I think, coming out of a toxic relationship with a narcissistic parent, because the world is so much more forgiving and lax than it was made out to be for so long, that it's almost, I feel these feelings of disbelief sometimes, because it's hard to believe that other people can be so kind and so forgiving. And, when you grew up in an environment where it was very black and white, either you did something or you didn't do it. If it wasn't 100, then it wasn't that great. It's hard to find that middle ground, that sort of gray area, which, I mean, that's what life is. I think, life is rarely black and white. I think so much of what we deal with throughout our day, throughout our week, throughout our lives as a whole is sort of messy and inconsistent because you don't know what's around the corner. You don't know what to expect. And a lot of those things you can't control. And coming to terms with the fact that you can't control those things, the only thing that you actually can have a firm handle on is how you react to those inconsistencies. Huge realization for me. Really, really helpful realization for me. And again, I think narcissists, with their obsession with control, they do try to control their environment. And I think that is sometimes why they get so easily triggered, because they want to have this sense of power and control. But life isn't something that can be controlled. Other people are not things that can be controlled. And so it's so easy, right? It's like around every corner, they're being triggered by something because they can no longer control it. They can't control something that they once thought they could. And so I guess having that has been part of maturing for me. That has been part of these realizations that I've had throughout this last year, is welcoming inconsistencies, sort of embracing them personally when it comes to the things that I'm putting out into the world, whether it's a video that I shoot in my truck, whether it's a podcast episode, the formatting of things, or in my life as a whole, where I wake up and I have a plan of what I want to do. And if at the end of the day, none of that gets done because something spontaneous happened in the middle of the day, and you know what? Instead of fighting against it, I embraced it. Because life, it's important to be spontaneous in life. It's important to sort of leave room for things to go a little differently and to not hyperfixate always on the goal. Because there doesn't always have to be a clear start to end to each day, right? And for me, it's made life so much more enjoyable to leave room for spontaneity and for excitement and for things that I didn't have planned, right? Because it's like I'm flexible. I can move. I don't have to get this done today to feel good about myself. Let me entertain what's happening in front of me right now. Because if I don't, maybe this moment will be gone forever, right? And I'll never be able to experience it again. So it's a good thing to be present. It's a good thing to be spontaneous. And I think something that's helped me to welcome that spontaneity has been entertaining the idea of positive change. And this goes back to, feeling like I was always walking on eggshells around my narcissistic parent, where if things were good, I wanted to keep them good, right? I didn't want to cause any waves. And I think a lot of times the idea of change, even in my adult life, I was very scared of. I was sort of averse to the idea of anything changing or doing things differently, especially if things were going pretty well right now. And I think the reason for that is because change from normal, consistent, right, maybe relatively calm, was a scary thing for a time. Because if it went one way, right, and things changed out of sort of the course of what our narcissistic parent wanted, that was going to be bad for everybody. And so now, understanding that change can actually be a positive thing, I still struggle to believe it sometimes, because I always think that change is negative. And I remember having that realization too this past year, where I was like, well, that, just because I said I was going to do one thing, or because we've been doing things a certain way for this amount of time, doesn't mean that we have to continue to do it like that for the rest of our lives, right? How boring is that actually, right? Let's change things up. Let's try something new. It was such a mental switch for me, just registering that change can be positive. Welcome change in your life, because at the end of the day, the relationships that will stay, the relationships that matter, the people who are there for you, and the trust that you have in yourself to handle different situations, that will all remain no matter your external circumstances. But again, that's a really hard thing to teach yourself as an adult, when in your childhood, if something changed, if you changed, and your parent didn't like that change, they could so quickly and easily retract all of their support and attention and affection from you. And so change, I think, for a lot of us was always associated with negative. It was a scary thing, and we didn't want to do it. I think developing that self-trust and having perspective of healthier relationships where it's, okay, there are people in my life who are going to stick with me no matter what. I can go and try this new thing, and guess what? No one is going to love me or care about me any less. It's real. It happens. And for me, like I said, I think it was just a matter of practice, baby steps, very small changes, and being very open with the people in my life about maybe the things that I was considering changing, right? And getting that reassurance from them. It's a matter of practice and slowly implementing that into your life with really small baby steps to show yourself that it is possible. And then I think a big one for me this past year was letting go of relationships that no longer serve me and the life that I'm living now, the life that I want for myself moving forward. And that started right after Brandon and I got married with my parents. Making the decision to go no contact was a really difficult decision, but at that point it felt like my only option. It was sort of my last resort. I had held out hope for a really long time that things would change, that they would change, that something that I said or did would knock some sense into them and they would see things for what they are finally. But after this cycle of sort of offering up these opportunities for things to go really well and then being disappointed by their behavior, I started to feel like I am benefiting nothing from this relationship because I don't feel comfortable being myself. I don't feel like my parents really know the person that I've become because of the nature of our relationship over the last 5 years. And I also don't feel comfortable talking about a lot of personal things in my life because we lost that trust years ago and we haven't taken steps to start to rebuild that. And so if I don't feel comfortable being myself, if I can't talk about important or exciting things that are going on in my life with you, and if I leave these interactions feeling really drained and stressed, I'm not benefiting from this relationship. And so why am I going to continue to be the one who's trying to fix things over and over and over again? So ultimately, I made the decision to go no contact. And it was hard, but I think the peace of mind that comes with it, the space for growth and evolution on a personal level is invaluable. And, when I think about this, I also think about my high school friends. I had a really great group of people that I was very close with in high school. And after moving out of my parents' house and dealing with some real separation anxiety for a while, COVID sort of furthered that, I would say, kind of intensified that. We had sort of a bumpy road towards the end, and I think I held out hope for a long time with those relationships also. And I was finally able to kind of reconcile that experience and those relationships and really feel comfortable with the fact that, sometimes there are people who are in your life for a time, and that's all that they're meant to be in your life for, and that's okay. And that took me a long time to kind of come to that realization and really believe it, not just tell that to myself on the surface, but to feel like I'm okay without those relationships anymore. And I can look back on the experiences that we did have when we were close and how positive and fun they were. They were for that time in my life, and that's okay. And I think the last thing that I'm going to touch on in terms of things that I have really gotten better with in this past year is allowing myself guilt-free downtime. And I was talking to my sister on my birthday, actually, and she was saying that, she can see how I've grown over the last year. And she was like, I used to call you, and every time I would call you, no matter what day it was or what time it was, you would always be working. You would always be doing something. And she's like, now, sometimes I'll call you and you're playing a video game or you're outside or you're just doing something that's fun. You're not always doing something that's centered on work that's considered objectively productive. And you're telling me about it. So not only am I allowing myself this downtime, but I don't feel guilty about it either. I can say to someone, oh yeah, I'm just going to go for a walk. It's a really nice day and I want to be out in the sun today, and not feel bad about that decision. And that was really, really hard for me to do, but I've started to truly feel and sort of reap the benefits of rest. Rest being productive. Time away from the thing that you're working on can sometimes make the time in it, the time with it, that much more productive, because you don't feel bogged down, you don't feel overwhelmed, you're not burnt out. I've experienced burnout multiple times throughout my life, and it's not conducive to productivity and creativity. You need to just live and experience life sometimes to actually be able to go back into the thing that you're working on and take significant steps forward towards your goal. It's unrealistic to always be working towards the same thing all the time, leaving no space for something else. And that's something that I think has manifested itself in the last year for me, where, when I reflect on, again, my past birthdays, these external accomplishments, we were working every day for 12 hours a day sometimes, just completely consumed. And so we were really nurturing this business. We were nurturing this one part of our lives, but we were eating really poorly. We weren't going to the gym. We weren't prioritizing our physical health. We were working on holidays and birthdays. We were neglecting personal relationships. And now, right, this past year, I feel like it's been so much more balanced, where I'm working, right? And I'm really enjoying the things that we're working on. I even have a desire sometimes to work more, which I think is so great. We're eating really good foods. We're thinking about what we're putting into our bodies. We're going to the gym and prioritizing our physical health. We're making time for important people in our lives. And I think something that I failed to realize was that by focusing so much on one aspect of your life, that it's almost something that you're made to feel proud of with this hustle culture, right? Where it's like, if you're not working, then there's someone who is, and they're working harder than you. If you're so focused on this one aspect of your life, you're going to neglect so many other aspects of your life. And I think for me, it's a matter of preference, I think. But as I've started to take the steps to start to get to know myself and start to understand what I want my life to look like, I want a life that's balanced. And I feel like in this past year, have really been able to start to take steps towards living a more balanced life, which I'm really, really proud of. And guilt-free downtime has definitely been a huge part of that. So with all of that in mind, I have some goals that I want to start to manifest, that I want to start to speak about. And I just kind of want to jump right into them and share them with you, because I think growth is such an intrinsic part of life. And I think the more that you can approach that with an optimistic headspace, when you get to a place, again, where you start to welcome change, right? And you start to think about the fact that change can be positive in your life, I think that is when you really start to see what you're capable of. It becomes fun as you start to sort of accomplish these things. And in doing so, you're building your own confidence in setting your goals, where maybe in the beginning, right, it was just baby steps. You were just setting very little goals that were, you can get there quickly, to show yourself that, okay, you can do it. And the more that you start to do this, you develop faith in yourself. You start to really develop that self-trust. And now maybe you can start setting loftier goals, bigger goals that in the beginning seemed way too far off, way too big to even start to think about. But now it's like, well, listen, I've done all these little things, right? So I'm going to take it a step farther. So much of that, I think, is directly tied to self-trust and having that more optimistic mindset in terms of welcoming positive change in your life and embracing change when it does come your way. And so moving forward, I feel like my goals for 27, one of the things that I've been, I guess, made aware of by myself in joining this social media community online is comparison. And I think, again, when you really get back into the roots of that, for anyone who is raised by an emotionally immature parent, I think there's a lot of comparison when you're younger. You're constantly being compared to other people, you're constantly being compared to this idealized version of yourself that your parent has kind of created for you. And I think it's really common for a lot of us to feel like we can never live up to those expectations because we're just people. We make mistakes, we're flawed, and we're not always going to do exactly what our parent wants us to do. And yet I think so many of us strive for that perfection because it doesn't feel good to be compared to other people in a negative way. And so something that I want to work on is admiration without comparison. I remember when I first saw Life Like Charlie on TikTok, which if you haven't checked him out, be sure to do it. And he's got this dog who was doing these little mouth snappies, and he started to really blow up on social media. And he was anytime I see him or his dogs on my feed, I'm so happy. And I remember thinking to myself, like, oh my gosh, I've got a skinny dog. And when I come home, like, she gives me a smile and she shows her teeth and it's so cute. I was like, why didn't I think of doing that? I could have done that. Right. And I think I want to start to kind of focus on, okay, just because someone's doing something that I like, that I admire, that I think is maybe objectively positive, doesn't mean that I have to do that too. And it doesn't mean that I have to compare myself to them, right? I feel like there's enough room for everyone. And the only thing that I can bring to the table is my authentic self. And that's the only way that I will ever be able to differentiate myself from the millions of other people who are sharing on social media. I shouldn't try to be someone else or to take an idea from someone and then embody that and try to use that as my own. The only way for me to do this and for me to do this sustainably and in a way that feels good is just to be myself. And I think, as I've gotten to know myself a little bit better, it's become a little bit easier to not always feel like I'm comparing myself to people, but I definitely still struggle with not comparing myself or my work to others and to other people's work, to things that I admire, things that I even maybe aspire to be like, maybe someone who's a little bit further along. So that's something that I really want to work on moving forward. And I also want to prioritize my physical health. I think this past year, like I said, has been so focused on my mental health. And I think that I really had to take a significant chunk of time, the better part of this past year, to just focus on that, to really understand what was going on in my life, in my mind, and understand what steps I could take moving forward to sort of continue on the right track. And I think now that I have a little bit of a better handle on that, I can start to include my physical health also. I can start to include my physical health also. We're going to the gym. Brandon and I are going to the gym again. We're starting to run now that it's getting nice outside. We're going to the track and we're starting to run more. And, my goals in terms of my physical health is to just be strong. I want to be strong and I want to be healthy. And that is definitely something that I want to prioritize moving forward, which kind of goes hand in hand with this next one, which is just putting myself out into the world. I remember a few months ago when Brandon asked me what I wanted to do for my birthday, I really didn't know. And again, part of it is just not feeling entirely comfortable saying, yeah, this is exactly what I want to do. This is where I want to do it. And one day I just had this idea and I was like, I want to go indoor rock climbing. I had only ever gone rock climbing once before in my life on like a wall, not an actual real rock. I was like 8 years old on the boardwalk. And even then, I remember it being so much fun. It felt like it came very naturally to me. It was kind of strategic because it was like, how can I get up here? But it was also physically demanding. And I was like, let's go indoor rock climbing. Now we have to go to a place that I've never gone to before. I don't know how it works. I don't know, really anything about it. It's sort of me putting myself out into the world and sort of setting myself up to be in a position that can be maybe a little bit embarrassing. Maybe I'm not going to know entirely how to do it. And I'm also asking someone to come along and do this with me, to also put themselves in sort of an unfamiliar situation. And that, I think, shows growth for me because I knew that, okay, no matter how the situation goes, right, it's okay for me to ask for this, for me to want to do this and ask someone to do this with me. And it was really great. I feel like I totally felt very in touch with like my inner child. It felt very true to me. And even this month, coming up this month, we're going to a couple of podcast networking events, to see other people who are doing the same things, to maybe try and gain some insights and make some connections. And this was something that I think, this time last year and even before then, I wouldn't really have been interested in, because I think my anxiety was just so high. And I think that so many of these different things felt almost frivolous compared to what I was dealing with internally. Everything felt so heavy that, something like going to a networking event and just tapping into my more social side, my outgoing side, it didn't seem like a priority to me, and I think enduring that kind of rejection from parents also, breaking out of a relationship like that, having sort of this smear campaign run on you, it definitely does take a toll on your self-confidence and the way that you view yourself. And this is something that I didn't start to realize until I started to come out the other end, where I was starting to feel more social and outgoing again. And I remember thinking, this is a familiar feeling. Like this, I am this person. And it was shocking to me how much experiencing that kind of trauma and breaking out of a relationship like that can make you feel like a complete introvert, just completely like you want to isolate yourself. And I think that's why working the way that we did in the beginning, even through COVID, just building furniture in a wood shop alone was exactly what I needed at that time, because I was able to kind of just shut the world out and focus on something positive. But now I feel so much more confident in who I am, because I think I have an idea of who I am now. And I like the person that I am, and I like the person that I'm becoming. That self-confidence has really started to resurface. And I'm so thankful for that, because it feels so good. I think when you start to reconnect with parts of yourself that you had to suppress for someone else's benefit, when it happens. That feeling. It feels so familiar and sort of just to your core, that it's like it's self-recognition. I think it's this is me. There's no question about it. And I think that is very much true for sort of putting myself out into the world and into these new, maybe unfamiliar social situations. And I want to continue to foster that side of me moving forward. And I think the last thing that I want to do during my 27th year, I guess throughout my 27th year, is to continue to grow Big Sis Casey. It's not normal to continue to grow this community. I still get comments and messages every day from people who say, I'm so thankful to have come across your podcast or your account, because I'm dealing with a narcissistic parent right now, and it's really made this particular thing a lot clearer. Or, I haven't heard this perspective before, and now I can sort of understand and navigate this situation a little bit better. And that, for me, has always been the goal, to just speak candidly about something that I think so many of us for so long were really encouraged, or maybe even pressured, to not speak about, to keep on the low, to not talk about this with anyone outside of the family, right? And I think to speak about this so publicly and so candidly, I think can be really beneficial. And all I want to do is help people, because dealing with this kind of abuse and manipulation it's so entwined with your version of who you are. I think your self-image, your other relationships in your life, it's all encompassing, sort of. It has such a drastic impact on so many other aspects of your life that, for me, it was really something that I had to address before I was able to move forward and take steps in a really positive way. And so if I just want to continue to kind of offer up my perspective and to connect with so many of you to kind of help all of us start to grow and break this cycle, this really toxic cycle that so many of us got caught up in. I think, reflecting on on my birthday, right? And just where I am in life now, I'm 27. I'm closer to 30 than I am to 20, which is, it's weird because obviously I've only ever been, younger than this, but I'm excited. I feel so much like myself. I'm really proud of the work that I have done in my personal life externally and now also internally. I feel in a lot of ways like I'm just starting out as this new version of myself that I'm really proud of. Sort of for the first time in my life, I feel free from a lot of the expectations or opinions of other people, where I think what's important to me is for the first time informing my decisions and my reactions, where now I can confidently say things and feel things and not question, is this coming from somewhere else? Is this someone else's opinion that I was sort of pressured to take on at some point? I now know how I feel about certain things, different things that I really want to do. There are characteristics of mine that I remember feeling and really leaning into when I was young, 8, 9 years old, that have resurfaced, that I'm recognizing. And it's like I'm getting to know myself again and in a lot of new ways. And so I'm really excited to be 27. But the thing that I didn't realize about being this age, being close to 30, is that I do not have everything figured out. I remember being a kid and thinking that adults, I had teachers that were my age now and thinking like, they know everything, like they probably got a house and a husband and kids and, like they've got it all figured out. And I think part of becoming an adult and maturing is recognizing that life is a constant process of figuring things out. I don't think you're ever going to get to a point when you feel like I've got everything under control, because as long as you're living, there are going to be things that are unpredictable, things that are outside of your control, that cross your path, that now all of a sudden you have to deal with or you have to figure out. And that's just part of life. And I'm really happy to have been, or I guess to have had that realization at this point, so that I don't follow in the footsteps of my narcissistic parent trying to control every aspect of my life, things that I just can't control no matter how hard I try. And for a little bit of perspective before I sign off for this week's episode, this is something else, another nugget of wisdom that my younger sister imparted onto me. The cast of Friends, right, when they shot the pilot episode, the characters in that show were in their late 20s and early 30s. That's all I've got to say. Let that marinate. With that, though, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode, and I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.